A very good afternoon to you, and welcome to Power Line's virtual roundtable or webinar on Electricity Amendment Bill 2022. My name is Alok Brara. I'm the publisher of the magazine, and we are going to discuss the bill, and we're going to have just a one-page or one-slide introduction by my colleague, and maybe there are two slides, Priyanka Quatra. And Priyanka, do you want to go ahead and do your one-page thing?
Yeah, sure, Alok. Khushi, could you please give me the rights to share my screen? Khushi, can you hear me? Could you please give me the rights to share the screen?
Yeah, I'll just do that. Yeah, the sharing rights are with panelists now.
Once again, very warm welcome to the webinar. Just one slide on the mission and the background in which we are organizing this webinar. The much-awaited Electricity Amendment Bill was finally introduced in the Parliament in August this year. And in the current form, it has proposed significant changes to the flagship Electricity Act 2003. Most importantly, it proposes to enable competition in retail power supply through non-discriminatory open access and allowing multiple distribution licensee in an area. While the amendment bill holds the promise to revive the segment, its latest version is believed to be watered down from the earlier drafts of the bill. There are also concerns about certain missing provisions and the modified scope of reform, which has now been proposed. With that background, the mission of the roundtable is to deliberate on the hits and misses of the Electricity Amendment Bill 2022, as well as its expectations going forward, impact on the sector, and how do we see the implementation ahead. The panel will discuss questions such as what are the hits and misses of the Act, what is the expected impact on the sector, what are the biggest issues and concern in the implementation, what are the future opportunities and outlook. With that mission and background, we are now ready to begin with the panel discussion. I will quickly introduce the speakers to all the delegates, and then we'll move ahead with the discussion.
Priyanka, I can do the bios. That's fine. Introduction.
Oh, sure.
Anyway, thank you for the introduction. And I'll be moderating along with Priyanka, and she'll ask some questions as well. And Rhea, you can turn on your video as well. Rhea is the director with India Africa Research, and Priyanka is the associate director, also leads Power Line magazine. Let me quickly introduce the five panelists, and I think you would know them all. Dr. Pramod Deo is former chairperson CRC, longest serving electricity regulator in India, has done a lot of work in energy area, written several books on energy planning, energy management, regulatory practice, has a postgraduate degree in physics, also has a doctoral degree in infrastructure economics, and has done postdoctoral research in energy policy and economics as well. Great to have you here, Dr. Deo, and wonderful to see you again. Also with us is Mr. Amit Kapoor, who is joint managing partner, JSA, JSA Associates, has done a lot of work in infrastructure in just about every area, energy, transportation, communication, etc. Worked with regulatory agencies, advised governments, advised private companies, advised multilateral organizations on just about every aspect of it. But he has been particularly active in policy reform area. And I think he's been working the policy reform area, at least that I know of, for at least 26, 27 years, maybe even longer. Right. I think I first attended a CIA workshop on power sector reforms. I think must have been 25 years ago or something where he was there. Right. That was so he's been associated with just about most of the reform initiatives in the infrastructure sector, particularly in energy. Wonderful to have you here, Mr. Kapoor. We weren't sure whether his hearing would finish before 4 or not, but I'm happy it did. Okay. Also, this is Mr. Sudhasatha Kundu, who is a strategy and transformation lead at RTI International, has got about 12 years experience. Previously has worked with India Energy Exchange, with ISGF, India Smart Grid Forum, also Pricewaterhouse India as well, and has worked with different utilities as well as different government organizations in South and Southeast Asia, and works in the area of distribution reforms, which is relevant here. Also power market operation. He's an electrical engineer, has an MBA in power management. Welcome, Mr. Kundu.
Thank you, Alok.
Also, great pleasure to have Mr. Sabyasachi Majumdar with us. He's Senior Vice President, Head of Power Sector Ratings, ICRA, a very old and a very good friend of our organization. He has been associated with ICRA Ratings now for almost 2 decades, responsible for ratings in power, telecom, sugar, agro-commodities, engineering, and cement sectors. Has also developed ICRA's methodology for assessing and grading solar energy service providers, energy service companies, and renewable energy projects. Also is ICRA's nodal person for assessment of state utilities and DISCOMs on behalf of Power Finance Corporation and Ministry of Power. And he's an electronics engineer from Delhi College of Engineering, also has a postgraduate diploma in management from IIM Lucknow. And this, of course, is all in alphabetical order, but we have finally Mr. Piyush Tandon, who is Chief Regulatory, Legal and Power Management, Tata Power Delhi Distribution Limited. And he was earlier Chief Regulatory Affairs at Tata Power, has got 2.5 decades of experience related to strategy, formulation, business development, electricity trading, procurement activities, regulations, financial evaluation, treasury, and project finance. So all over. He's an electrical engineer from National Institute of Technology, Jamshedpur, also has a postgraduate diploma in management as well. So we've got, one ex-regulator, we have one legal expert, we've got one consultant, we have got one financial analyst, and then we have one operator. So I think that should provide for a very good discussion. I have to say it's gotten a very good response. We have about 187 people right now registered, or not registered, more registrations, but 187 people are attending right now. I myself wasn't sure whether I was going to be able to do it, but somehow I moved the meeting along, so because I wanted to be here for this as well. So let's get started. We're going to make it a mostly freewheeling discussion. So short answers, so we can have lots of rounds of questions. And to those of you who are attending, please write in your questions as and when they occur to you. Otherwise, in the end, if you say, we probably won't have time for your questions. So if I know there are going to be 15 questions, then I'll make time for 15 questions. Otherwise, I might make time for just 2 or 3. And then if 15 come, then we can't answer them. So write them in chat or write them in Q&A, wherever you prefer. Q&A would be preferable, but chat is also okay. With that, let me just go to the first question. What are the big hits and misses of the bill? And the order is going to be Dr. Deo, then Mr. Kapoor, then we are going to go with Mr. Tandon, then we're going to go with Mr. Majumdar, and then Mr. Kundu. Yeah, Dr. Deo.
Yes, please.
Yeah, sir, what are the big hits and misses as far as you're concerned? Things that you wished were there are not there, and things that you are happy are there.
Well, if you were to go back to the 2003 Act, it envisages very interestingly competition in a way because of through open access. If you see the preamble to the Act, it doesn't say privatization. It is competition. And the whole idea was that the large consumer, mainly the industrial and commercial, had choice to select their supplier. And obviously there is a provision till certain period. If they go out of the net of a distribution company, then there will be loss of revenue. So concept of cross subsidy and then additional cross subsidy, all of you can find in the Act. And anyway, we know that in 2005, when the UPA came, there were some amendments. Originally, the Act said that cross subsidy shall be eliminated. Instead of eliminated, the word has been reduced at 20% margin. All those things are there. So now what is the change really we are talking about here? Here we are talking of multiple licensing. Even in the original 2003, there's the concept of parallel licensing, but the context was different. That was for certain areas where the electricity board were not able to supply electricity, but because of their jurisdiction being the entire state. So if you were to take Jharkhand Electricity Board did not have network over entire state. So they were given that. That was kept in mind. But if you read it, it doesn't say that it is only for certain states. It can be anywhere. And that's how you find that the this parallel licensing business started in Mumbai. In fact, it's very interesting that this case came to us when we were hearing it under the old act, not the 2003. And the issue was that whether Tatas have a license to distribute electricity in the suburb or not. And we concluded that they do have a license because originally Tatas were serving the large consumers, mainly the textile mills, then Mahindra, L&T, but they did not have a network everywhere. And that was the reason order, and very interestingly, this order was issued just after the 2003 Act had come. And that Act very clearly, in our order, very clearly said, this is something which needs to be studied before it can be implemented. But as we know the history, the lawyers went and argued. Finally, Supreme Court held that why can't they use the same network? And the problem then it had, and their problems are still continuing. So the result is that Tata started supplying to airport, but then the slums were left to what used to be BSES and Reliance. Now it is Adani. So this obviously created a problem. Then MERC has to do this exercise and do various things. So given this concept, one has to see also, this I'm just giving as the background, it is necessary to see, it's not something completely new which has come, but the real issue which we really need to understand and why it is not getting any traction. Because since 2014 December, we are having different versions of the bill, and it is the political economy of electricity, and with the states now going for elections almost every year now till 2024, I don't see how this bill will at all be taken up or passed. So I'll just stop here. I raised this issue because the most important thing is industry and commercial consumer have to cross-subsidize in large states where you have a quite good number of residential consumers who can cross-subsidize small residential consumers. That's not the difficulty. If you were to take Maharashtra, Gujarat, that's not the issue. But the difficulty comes in the other states where the residential consumers also will have to cross-subsidize. I will go into some certain numbers later, but I thought that as an introduction, these are the points, important points to be remembered.
Thank you. Mr. Kapoor.
Thank you. Good evening, good afternoon to all of you. Dr. Dev, always a pleasure to hear you. Unfortunately, now I'm coming after you rather than before you. You would normally rule after I had finished. So I think it's a very challenging ask if you look at where we are in the power sector. So some misses are a consequence of the true political economy which we face. And these are, amongst other things, I would have loved to see that we would pull out the state regulators out of the state umbilical cord and put them into regional regulators, a recommendation that I have been at least fighting for since literally the last 10 years. And we don't see that. In fact, to the contrary, I must say with utmost respect, because of at times reasons of faltering performance by some regulators, at times perceptions, that there is a tendency of the government occupying more space which was allocated to the regulator. So that is, to my mind, a very, very difficult problem that we are going to see in the years to come. There is going to be a conflict between three subordinate legislative instruments: policy, you have electricity policy, you have tariff policy, and you have rural electrification policy. Rules framed by the state and the center, and regulations framed by the regulators and at center and state. And then you have regulations which are notified by CEA as the national planner. So there is a need for effort to try and streamline and put a hierarchy around that, and also allocate the roles at distinction, because the tendency to conflate and then to litigate as per your commercial interest is unfortunately a reality of the sector. And that reality emerges from the second big issue, which I don't think the law can tackle, but I was hoping that there would be something which came along with the law to tackle it. And that is the financial economic reality of the sector. The financial economic reality of the sector, I'm talking about the fact that RBI had come up with a state finances risk analysis in June 2022, where they said that the impact of state subsidy and freebies included 40% of all contingent liabilities related to power sector guarantees. So you can imagine at the national level, the subsidies and the contingent liabilities that exist in the power sector, issues of regulatory asset, issues of deferred liability, contested cases. What we find at the Prapti website is becoming a bugbear for the nation now. And that, to my mind, is something which needs to be addressed. How are you going to ring fence and for once and for all, put a plan at a national level to liquidate it in a defined manner, perhaps harnessing long-term financing, cheaper financing, so that the burden can be reduced. The moment you are able to substitute a 6-year, 8-year debt by a 25-year debt financing instrument, which can be done if the sovereign wanted to, you would have a very different outcome, because 100 rupees of debt, which is perhaps 80%, 75% of the capex invested in the sector, would be returned instead of 5 years, which is 20 rupees per year in the principal, over 25 years, which means 4 rupees a year. You can imagine what is the impact on the entire tariff structure, affordability of power. And that can impact many industries, because we are still living in the world where the cross-subsidy burden is far higher than even the regulators acknowledge today transparently. It is built through surcharge, additional surcharge, cross-subsidy surcharge. And that I don't find being addressed. And the reason why I raise that is because we have a situation where repeatedly distribution companies and generating companies, even the private sector and transmission companies, face the challenge of IBC, bankruptcy. While their recovery of dues, the bankruptcy and IBC is a 180-day cycle as per law. But their dues which are to be paid, acknowledged by the regulator, admitted by the law. For example, just to cite a case, is the matter that you sorted as the foundation, Dr. Dev, the NCDP matter, the energy watchdog case. The case was filed in 2011 as an outcome of NCDP and the Indonesian coal. Till date, we are now talking in 22 end. All the dues that ought to have been recovered are yet to start getting recovered. Only some generators have been able to recover. Now, you can imagine what it does in terms of the sentiment of investment in the sector. So I'm not only looking at the law by itself, but the law along with a stated policy to try and find a transition path out is necessary before we move to a full-blown market mechanism. Because as you are going to go through separation of wires from supply, grant open access as rightly should be done for consumer choice, your challenge will be how are you going to tackle this distortion which will be there, which is a burdensome problem for some of the generators who are incumbents, who haven't recovered their dues. As they recover, their tariffs will become completely unviable and they will compete on a very uneven turf. On the one hand, they are not recovering their dues and carrying the cost burden. On the other, when they liquidate their due, the tariff goes out of gear. So I think there is a structural issue which has to be dealt with. Perhaps it has to be dealt with in the policy. And why I say that is because Energy Conservation Act amendment, which is pending, which is relatable, the energy transition field, there is a lack of signal from this amendment of how are you going to integrate that with the carbon markets coming as you move forward. And perhaps these two will be addressed more in the policy and the regulatory framework as we evolve on the rules, perhaps. But it remains an abiding concern that we had an opportunity of addressing virtually 50% of NPAs of the country, where as per the acknowledgement now, the loss per unit of electricity today is more than ₹1.12, acknowledged in the PFC report in August 2022. Every unit of electricity supplied across the country is aggregating a loss of ₹1.125 per unit without providing for return on equity. That foundational issue, with total debt of the sector in 2021 standing at 5,89,000 crores, with the sector liquidity gap of over 3 lakh crores, I think there is a need for a much stronger emphasis, even through legislation, I was hoping that there will be some principle built into Section 61, which will perhaps force the hands of regulators and give strength to those who want to actually do the job to move forward. And all credit to Dr. Dev and the CRC when they took up matters of that nature and found solutions without that support. But it's not necessary that we'll find that willingness every time. I'll stop here and then maybe we can deliberate later.
Mr. Tandon?
Good afternoon, everybody. I will actually take forward from where Dr. Dev and Mr. Kapoor left, the political uncertainty and the way it will take it forward. So if you look at it, this bill actually starts with a provision wherein it recognizes that all provisions would have a different date of notification of start actually. So it could so happen that some regulation, some act, some provision of that act will have different date of notification. So that realization is already there in the document. So I would say that is a very relevant realization of intent. I actually would take the issue of consumers' choice that has been brought in this bill. Now, if I look at it from an operator's perspective, yes, the consumers are getting a choice to source their supply from a distribution company or a licensee as it is being designed here. But who will build that network is a question. The Act in original form actually sought distribution licenses to develop their network and then supply power to the consumers. Here, it is that supply should happen, but the network foundation, who will do that is a question mark, considering what is the realization, tariff realization that Mr. Kapoor just talked about, ₹1.12 loss. I think the network expansion, augmentation is an issue that has not been appropriately addressed here. And I think that is one of the biggest misses which I find in the bill. So that is a small synopsis that I would put across. Happy to take our questions later on.
Mr. Majumdar.
I think I'll broadly agree with conclusions of the other members as well. I think broadly this is all the steps are in the right direction in the sense that we are talking about competition and all enabling provisions in place. Now, broadly, overall, it's a positive, but obviously one con, of course, we can think about is, at the end of the day, power is a concurrent subject, and someone may argue that the proposal to make, CRC a very strong entity goes, contrary to the federal ethos. But again, the problem but the opposite side is that the problem really lies at the state level. It's the state level, several states are not doing enough to make the, DISCOMs, sustainable on a financial basis. So one could argue that although, this gives greater power to the center and the central regulator, perhaps that's the requirement of the day. But I think the other fundamental really issue is that, as, other, speakers have also pointed out that, litigation, obviously, irrespective of who is the, regulator or who is the, what is the regulatory or legislative framework, obviously there will be, litigations and, it's just taking too long. Like, for example, for instance, this case was pointed out about, compensation for imported coal. It has been more than a decade and not enough, very hardly any compensation has been paid. So really, I think, although of course this amendment itself is a step in the right direction, what really needs to be done is beyond the scope of the legislation and regulations. Basically, we have to ensure that, all contracts are enforced and they're enforced on a timely basis. It's not that, whoever is the authority, whether it's the regulators or others, they can, go. Litigation shouldn't go on forever and, the affected party gets this, cash flows getting blocked up. Other thing, of course, is that, the state governments have to get their act together. Ultimately, it's for the state governments to decide whether they want the state power sector to be run in a fundamentally, cost-reflective and efficient manner. because ultimately without, the state governments being, adequately on board, the fundamental turnaround of the power sector would be very difficult. That's my overall thoughts on the matter.
Okay. Mr. Kundu?
Yeah, good evening. And the point that hits there is that from the Electricity Act, competition is more of a pertinent thing that they're trying to bring in. But what are the misses is that how to go about the legacy PPAs that the DISCOMs are already holding. Secondly, how the adequacy of the infrastructure will be required there, because if you are coupling it with the RDSS, where the distribution strengthening is already mentioned, then how to manage those structural changes and couple it with the RDSS and the new retailers. Secondly, when you're talking about this cross subsidy, how that will be phased out, subsidy and the cross subsidy, because we're creating a cross subsidy fund and all those things. So the cross subsidy is again coming into picture. And when the cross subsidy is there, the subsidy will be there. If the new retailers are getting the cross subsidy, then what the DISCOMs will go. So these things are there. And thirdly, the energy transition or the distributed energy resources that are coming into the picture with the distribution grid, like EVs, the distributed storage, as well as the rooftop solars. How the DISCOMs or the retailers can take leverage of that to reduce the cost of electricity. And there is no mention on that and how to utilize those resources on the markets and the market design for that. So those things need to be taken care into along with the regulations that are already prevalent in the sector with energy storage and others. So this is where I'll stop from my side.
Okay. I think my colleague Rhea is going to do the next round. Rhea.
Yeah, thanks, Alok, and good afternoon to all the panelists. Like you've all pointed out, there are several issues in the current form. My question to all the panelists is, what sort of impact do you see the bill to have on different segments of the power sector as a whole, as you see it today? Dr. Deo, if you could go first.
Sorry, I didn't get your point.
What impact do you see of the bill on the overall power market, on the overall power sector in its current form?
No, if you ask me the overall power sector, the basic issue is how the state governments will be able to meet the political goals. That's what we are talking of the political economy of electricity. And that is a real issue, because when Amit spoke about the deficit of 1 rupee 10 paisa as it exists, actually that's not only the thing. Because if we take the case of Maharashtra government use whatever the tariff is determined by regulator for agriculture. Now, if you have to take one tariff order, you'll find that 7 rupee 31 paisa is the average cost of supply. And the regulator has determined tariff of 3 rupee 71 paisa. State government wants it to be only 1 rupee 50 paisa. So they straight away give 5,000, 6,000 crore per year to bring it to like 3.71. So farmer will have to pay only 1 rupee 50 paisa. But the reality is, farmers have not paid for the last many years. Now all this money in the balance sheet is based on the accrual basis. So it is shown that this money to be recovered. Unless it is written off, so the result is that the DISCOM, and Maharashtra is interesting, it has only one DISCOM, because this exercise was attempted whether we can break it into more. It was found that it was not possible to do that because of concentration of industries in the western region of the state. You could not really have a balanced system. And one of the reasons why World Bank took Orissa had that interesting thing because they have very small consumption in agriculture. So that's why they thought that would be easy. Although the stage of rural electrification is very poor, whereas in Maharashtra, the feeder separation for agriculture has already happened. But still, now what will happen to this 10,000 crore to 20,000 crore, which is hidden in the balance sheet, which has to be written off? So it has to be written off some state. Now, if this is not written off, otherwise it shows that these are the dues which have to come. And they will never come because farmers are not going to pay, because it's completely a political issue. In fact, the entire election, you will find that Maharashtra will be fought on that. That is the one, how the consumer should pay. So which means finally what happens? In Maharashtra, it's very interesting that 1 megawatt and above, there are only 1 lakh consumers. They contribute 40% of the revenue. So all the subsidy goes to agriculture. As I said that it's 7 rupees 31 paisa and 3 rupees 71 paisa is fixed by MERC. But that is the one part. So if you want to reduce the tariff for industry and they will definitely like to go to other suppliers. But if they want to go to other suppliers, what will happen to the agriculture economy? And we know that the farmers' agitation has shown that there also the center finally had to withdraw. So this becomes an issue of center-state relations, and now we are going to have state elections one after another till 2024. So this is my main point. What is the solution to that? Because this money is shown in the balance sheet as recoverable, but it is not paid. And that's one reason why direct benefit transfer will not work in agriculture. Because since the farmers are not going to pay, if you were to give that money to farmers, then they are not going to pay even that money, but they will pocket it. And these are the farmers who are basically growing cash crops. That is the reality. That being the case, it becomes very difficult to address this issue. And then again, the center-state relations issue come. Even if you were to have one party ruling all the states, still you will find that each chief minister wants to come. Prime Minister very rightly said the agriculture has to go. But you find that, again, the politicians start talking about that only. They offer those revenues. And that's how you appeal to your electorate.
Thank you. Same question for Mr. Majumdar. What are your thoughts on the overall impact, and do you think it will set out the objectives of reducing cost of power or improving the quality of supply? What is your overall take on the impact?
If the amendment was to be implemented with 100% accuracy, obviously the gainers will be the most efficient generating companies and also relatively high-paying consumers. I mean, if the whole provisions were to be implemented without too many distorting surcharges and all, obviously the high-paying customers, high-usage customers, including HT customers, they would possibly be able to arrange power from the cheapest suppliers, and even with whatever such charges need to be paid, possibly they will be able to get it at best rates. Similarly, the most efficient generating companies, assuming that they are not, to the extent that they are not bound by the older PPAs, they would be able to find out the best paying customers. The losers in this process would be the DISCOMs, particularly those which have relatively poor operating efficiency norms and particularly high losses. And also in the process will be impacted, the agricultural and the domestic consumers, and indirectly the state governments, because then the question will be, how do you support, if your ability to generate cross subsidy is restricted because of implementation? How does the state government go about funding? So obviously, under those circumstances, a different mechanism may have to be worked out. I mean, you may have to have a scenario where you have to go for, like in the case of gas and many others where we have gone for DBT. Possibly the governments will have to look at alternative mechanism to ensure that the bottom of the pyramid consumer is not impacted. But overall, I think yes, distribution companies will be the ones which will be most impacted negatively.
Understand. Mr. Kapoor, same question for you. Your thoughts on impact?
I think the question of impact has to be considered in context of what we are trying to do. There is no doubt that there are some very progressive provisions, and they're well-meaning. The issues have been highlighted, but unless you are going to iron out the wrinkle, I suspect that there will be challenges and there will be counterwinds, and I am worried for that. At the end of the day, what are those big ticket objectives that the legislation puts out? If you look at the statement of objects and reasons, in para 3, they say that they want to strengthen the regulatory mechanism. While stating so, The question that arises is that will it be strengthened by expanding the role of the government in the regulatory mechanism, or by actually ensuring accountability of the regulatory mechanism? What has happened is that actually the role of the government has become higher. On several spaces that were allocated for regulation, that's economic regulation. And don't forget that even today, 95% of distribution, if not 97%, is in government hands. So if you have the state government with the state regulator, and the state government and the central government are framing rules, there is some challenge which comes in terms of dealing with issues of a level playing field. The whole issue of regulatory framework was driven from the point of view of getting a level playing field and inducing competition. Second issue, if you are saying that you are actually working to strengthen the adjudicatory mechanism, which is also stated, well, the bill seeks to suggest that it is not available anymore to the regulators to refer a dispute to arbitration. While the country is saying that we want, the Prime Minister has been saying all along that they want, he wants and the government wants to make India as the arbitration hub. So why would you eliminate the possibility of a regulator referring a dispute that the regulator feels they are constrained? Let's say the matter lands up, which is a very complex issue before a regulatory commission, which is snowed under with tariff determination. Let's take MERC for that matter. They have multiple distribution companies. All of them file at the same time, and they are required to as per law. And their tariff determination exercise can be quite burdensome. Now, at that time, a few serious disputes come. Is it not fair that they should have the ability to refer it to arbitration by perhaps a panel which comprises a technical member from the regulatory space, or an economist and a judge, to decide the matter in a focused manner rather than taking on the burden? After all, time value of money in India is very, very different from the West. In the West, you get loan for 1%, while in India, you are getting loan at 12 and 14%. It's a very costly attitude towards dispute resolution when you forget that the consumer is going to bear the burden. It is not that the regulator or the institution which is deciding will bear the burden. The third issue, they say that they're going to strengthen the mechanism by streamlining concurrence for hydro. I think there is a good thing that they've done. But why would CA not be engaged in consultation? Similarly, they say they will strengthen the functioning of the NLDC for ensuring safety and security of the grid. But the amendment suggests that no power shall be scheduled or dispatched under the contracts unless adequate security of payment as prescribed by the central government has been made. Now consider this. But there is no clarity as to whether it will apply to existing contracts or future contracts. How do you deal with that situation? If the security mechanism has to be put in place, there's an added cost. How do you allow the framework for that? Then it says that it's effective management of power purchase and cross-subsidy in case of multiple distribution licensing. How will that happen if you have not addressed the legacy of regulatory assets which are under discharge, which is not the same for all? How will you deal with the fact that the second proviso of Section 60A capital is completely disjuncted, since the proviso envisages that no additional requirement of power will be shared with other distribution licensees? So somewhere there is a need for a guidance, perhaps in Section 61 or elsewhere, where the regulation and governance of the sector has to be driven, keeping the one person the focus, but often gets neglected. That's the consumer. Because if you're going to defer decision making, in the name of consumer interest, you are actually adding the burden on the consumer, because 5 years from now, when you'll pay LPSC and carrying cost at 12%, 14%, 16% compounding, the burden on the consumer is much higher. If I as a consumer know that the cost of electricity is not 5 rupees but 10, I may perhaps use lesser number of lights and fan and air conditioning. But 5 years later, when it is imposed through judgments of courts, I have no option but to cover. So there is a need for us to understand that there is a criticality of time, value for money and decision making. And there is a need for us to try and ensure that the implementation is tied up with the ground realities. We are not in a greenfield situation where we are trying to evolve a legal regulatory framework for the first time. Electricity Act 2003 is going to complete 20 years on 9th of June 2023. We are 19 years and a few months in. And the legacy of the sector continues. The legacy is that today we are sitting, as I told you, with financials which are horrific. It's great credit to PFC that after long years, we used to always have the annual report from Planning Commission, which you would refer to, that finally PFC report in August 2022 does accept some real hard realities which are facing us. And ultimately we are trying to paper over. So my concern is that unless you are going to bring in those enabling tools along with it, these legislative instruments may not necessarily achieve the objective that they seek. It will induce competition, but there are barriers to competition. And the barriers are of all the ilk. I mean, if you want to go into it, we can go into another round on that. It is a completely different play. But that then completely defiles, it blunts the edge. So we need to create the environment to implement this reform. And that has to be by addressing the legacy challenges, as my colleagues on the panel have already indicated.
Thank you. Mr. Tandon?
I will again go back to the basic idea. Why are we there and why are we discussing this matter today? It's because the consumer wants electricity supply, which is a quality electricity supply and is available round the clock. Now, when we talk about quality and round the clock thing, costs come into play. And what we see all across India is, borrowing from Mr. Kapoor's observation, is that the costs which are there today on the table are not being serviced by the tariff that is being charged to the consumers. And what we see regulatory assets. Delhi is one of the example where we have regulatory assets sitting in our books from the day the privatization took place, 2004. So what, plus this bill also talks about something. When we talk about costs, subsidy disbursal is also one of the elements that is built in the Electricity Act in form today, which talks about advance payment of subsidy. Not happening. We are talking about in the bill about cross subsidy fund, stabilization fund, and the likes of that, which actually is talking about again where there is no timeline specified for that payments as well. So what we are trying to do is we are trying to delay the payment mechanism from the consumer to the distribution company, and yes, distribution companies would bleed further the way it has been drafted. If you look at the scenario with respect to roads, when we were young, there were no roads per se, and we used to pay only the road tax and utilize whatever was available for transportation. Today, when we are paying tolls, paying tolls across places, we see a lot of good roads on the road. Why it is happening? It is happening because we are paying the real cost of the service that is being provided to us. And in this realization has to happen in the power sector. Otherwise, we are getting to a situation where the distribution utilities will have no money to fund the gaps that are there, and we will have PFCs and RECs just bankrolling these gaps to whatever extent. I don't know when, till what time. I don't think so that situation should come where we have no money to do. To run the business, which we are required to do.
Mr. Kundu, your thoughts? You're on mute, Mr. Kundu.
I'm sorry. Actually, I totally agree to what Mr. Kapoor said. Actually, it's totally depend on the context of how it's getting implemented. Because it's good to hear that there will be competition, but how the legacy PPAs will be treated when the retailer will come, right? If the retailer comes and the legacy PPAs are there, the retailer has to take it forward, the demand or consumer base that it is being estimating is not there, then how that will be going to treat it, how there will be impact on the prices, how that will impact the consumers. So if you're saying that it will only for the consumers that you are doing it, but the exact impact has not been gauged properly. They need to do that after doing this, how the retailer will behave with all the changes on the network infrastructure. Because some of the retailers will get the cream consumers, what you call the C&I consumers, or the cross subsidy and others, how the others retailers or the distribution companies, they will get those, the consumer base of those, and how that will be treated. So ultimately, obviously, the ultimate objective for the last few years or the last 2 decades, I think, the reducing the ACS and error gap for the distribution companies is that will happen through this implementation. There is no proper guidelines how to trade. tap those things. Secondly, when we are talking side by side on the renewable energy or the energy transition that we're doing up, how to leverage those resources on that. That is also not being tapped currently by the distribution companies. So the retailer will go for these or not, because they will also go for these where there is a quick money for them. They're not going to invest if there is no certainty on their side, right? So how the distribution infrastructure will get, because with the RDSS scheme, we are hoping that the distribution infrastructure will be strengthened in few places, but also it needs to be optimized, because in various states in India, the assets are there, but with the DERs coming in, the assets need to be optimized. You cannot, some of the states are overburdened with assets also, right? They're not properly utilized with the DERs coming and all those things. So we need to properly plan. We have to have a proper guidelines in place, or you can say proper market design should be there so that they can reap the optimal benefits, what actually the act is looking into, along with the regulations that the regulatory side, Mr. Kapoor has already mentioned. What are the lacunas there? Because we cannot go to the regulator, cannot go to the arbitration. They have to come out with their own judgment itself. There's a timeline on that that leads to pressure and how that will come out. So those things, keeping in mind those things, I think it all totally depends on how it is getting implemented, because it's just a guideline that's a thought that government is coming up with, or the Electricity Act, but the implementation guidelines, the ground reality is totally different actually from these things. So that needs to be taken care of. Thank you.
I see there are about 20 questions from the audience as well. So what we are going to do now is I'm going to let my colleagues ask their questions. So what we'll do is one question from Priyanka, one from Rhea, and then I'll pick one from the audience, and we'll go around, and hopefully we'll cover 15 of them. Priyanka, you begin.
Thanks, Alok.
And decide
My next question is regarding the provision of multiple licensees. So how do you see the proposal changing the ownership, the change of proposal of ownership? How do you see it improving the efficiency going forward? What sort of models do you see emerging in the market going forward? And this time I'll start with Mr. Kapoor. Sir, your thoughts on how is it all going to pan out going forward, especially when we talk about multiple licensees?
Well, I think multiple licenses is a concept which is well thought of from the point of view of consumer choice, but it misses even now the big picture issue. You are going to look at segregation of buyers and supply. There was a fundamental flaw in the statute which required that every time a second licensee come in a distribution area, that licensee must have its own network. That was malicious. Sorry, there's
an echo somewhere.
Yeah. Can you hear me now? Can I start? Yeah. Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah. So foundationally, the problem was that you have that whole challenge of how do you work it out when you are not going to address the problem of switching from one to the other network. This is already being experimented in Bombay. It has led to myriad disputes, and there's no resolution. And the basic reason is when a consumer switches from a distribution licensee A to a distribution licensee B, the consumer has, even without being told, a contingent liability in terms of regulatory assets which are yet to be recovered, yet to be actually levied, yet to be acknowledged. For example, if you have, as I was mentioning to you, energy watchdog or the claims of all generators on account of NCDP coal not being available, therefore substituted second coal, whether imported or otherwise, with higher prices, which has been granted, approved by the Supreme Court in 2017, yet getting implemented step by step. A consumer switches from a distribution company A to B without having paid. Who will recover it? A distribution company cannot recover it in a vacuum. Will it be recovered from a consumer who shifted from A to B? Will it be loaded on the consumer base which stays back with A? How are you going to bring rationality? There are regulatory assets which have built up over the years. I mean, in Delhi itself, it is alarming. Piyush mentioned it in the passing. But in Delhi, the ARR of each of the distribution companies between BRPL, BYPL, and TPDDL would not be more than 7,000 crores each. 7,000 crores that they recover annually would comprise 80%, which is to be paid to the generators and to the transmission company. They are left with the balance 20. And this is a notified, published data given by DRC, not my data. If the 20% of 7,000 crores is available for the distribution business, after defraying all the costs, out of which several times the actual cost is not allowed, and that has to be recovered after appeals, you're left with 16% return. Even if you get 16% return, which is the higher, out of 7,000, 20%, which is 1/5, so 1,400 crores. Out of 1,400 crores, so 16%, 140 plus another 84, so 200 to 300 crores. And you're sitting with a regulatory asset which ranges from 7,000, 5,000, 6,000 crores to 20,000 crores. How are you going to recover it? Where is the headroom? If you now allow somebody to come and compete with me, what is my hope of recovery? There are licenses that are coming to it. Electricity Act came in 2003. The private distribution companies are being told that your license is all of 25 years. Statute says so. Even those who had actually open-ended licenses, like the pre-2003 Act, they have also been told that you have to now accept that it's 25 years and no further. Now into 23, 22, from 2003, you're 20 years in, 5 years are down the line. How do you take care of the regulatory asset of that distribution licensee, which has not seen recognition and payment till now? Where does it get factored in? The barriers which have been created of open access and cross-subsidy surcharge. Do you know that surcharge barriers in the highest state, and I'm not mentioning the state, is around 3.5, 4 rupees a unit? Now, 3.5, 4 rupees a unit is absolutely a crime. The generator's cost in an efficient renewable energy plant is 2 rupees 60 paisa. And the cross-subsidy surcharge by which you can buy is another 4 years or 4 rupees or 3.5 rupees on top. How can that be even allowed? But that's being done. Unless these distortions of the market reality are not altered, getting a second and a third licensee will not achieve the purpose. The purpose should be a fair competition amongst people who are equally well placed. It's no fault of the distribution licensee, whether it's a state-owned distribution licensee or a private distribution licensee, that they have not been paid the dues and the subsidies by the government, that the judgments have come but they have not been implemented. That's political economy. Can you now make them all bankrupt to create second distribution licensees? Will the banks be willing to lend for it? Because ultimately the burden of this is going to be again handled only by two people. It's either the R.K. Lakshman's common man, that's the consumer of electricity who pays for the bills, or it's the taxpayer. There is no third source of money. When government gives subsidy, it's not that the ministers cut a check out of their earnings and their wealth. They take it from the consolidated fund, which is meant for paying and creating infrastructure for education, primary healthcare, livelihood, and giving it away to pay salaries and pay costs which ought to have been priced in the tariff. So unless you are going to solve this problem, you're addressing pieces without addressing the main issue. The elephant in the room is the fundamental cumulative financial difficulty of the sector as a whole. 6 lakhs crore built up from 43,000 crores when Montek Singh Malwalia bailout came, which was at the back of electricity reforms. It's 15 times. How are you going to resolve that? So till you resolve that, these will be only pieces. So you will have competition in Delhi and Bombay. But will you be able to take it to the benefit in the hinterland, in the rural areas? Will you be able to actually induce it in tier 2 cities which are now pushing to grow, wanting electrification so that new developments can come and people can achieve their aspirations? I don't think so. So those have to be prepared and done very quickly.
Thank you, Mr. Kapoor. Mr. Tandon, my next question to you is the same question as from the operator's perspective. How do you see the implementation of multiple licenses going forward? What are going to be the implementation challenges? And also, do you feel that the change in ownership will improve the operational efficiency of the DISCOMs?
Okay, see, I would start from where I started earlier as well, is that multiple licenses in today's form we are talking about is that there is no requirement of putting a network. Who will put that network? See, at the end of the day today, if I'm sitting in Delhi, regulatory assets of around 6,000 to 7,000 odd crores they have no color, whether it is regulatory asset pertaining to wheeling or it is supply, whether the RA is with respect to wires or for that matter supply, there is no color. So first of all, the allocation of this regulatory asset has to happen for determining the cost for wheeling that is being talked about in the act. Second, if you look at it, the consumers, all licenses would come up. There are only 3 conditions that need to be fulfilled. They are all financial conditions, and all the companies which are there today, the private operators that are there today would be able to meet that requirements and would be using the wires of the existing DISCOM to meet the consumer demand. But the real challenge would be with respect to when this system gets loaded. For that matter, today, if the distribution company is putting up 300 to 400 crores a year, or maybe 500 crores a year in putting capital infrastructure in place, who will do that infrastructure at the ground level would be a challenge. The second important challenge that will be there is that today the metering, there has to be a metering entity in between, because one customer switching from, say, Tata Power Delhi Distribution Network to X, that the meter which is there to measure the consumption cannot be owned by the DISCOM A or DISCOM B, because the mechanism of settlement of electricity that Mr. Kapoor talked about has to be a third person there who will certify that this payment has to be made by this consumer, and this money has to be adjusted in the bills of this consumer from the distribution company B. That mechanism is also not being there in the act that is being talked about. So till these structural changes, these structural matters are being settled, all this would be a wish list and would be leading into a lot of further litigations, which could come up in the future.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Majumdar, your thoughts on what sort of business regime is going to emerge with multiple licenses?
Yeah, I think the basic points has already been made, that multiple licensing regime is definitely going to improve the overall operational efficiency. But having said that, those legacy issues, I mean, who bears the regulatory assets, remains to be answered. Secondly, if, for example, the wires will still be owned by the existing operator, and let's suppose that entity is not in a healthy shape. I mean, if they are not, they will not be able to invest in upkeep of the network. And in fact, there's always a possibility that with loss of high-paying customers, their financial position may actually worsen, and thus their ability to even undertake the routine O&M activities might be adversely impacted, in which case everyone is going to be, all customers, including whether it's from the existing licensee or the new licensees who come into the picture, everyone is going to suffer. So unless, these issues are, handled, like what to do about the, legacy liabilities of this DISCOMs, and ensuring that all successor entities are equally financially viable, which would require substantial commitment on part of the state governments. The whole benefit of the exercise will not be achieved.
So before I move on, just one last question to you. Do you think the private players will indulge in cherry picking when it comes to going ahead with the multiple licensing thing?
Yes,
and do you think the act takes,
Yeah.
so please go ahead.
Yeah, no, please continue. Yeah.
So do you think the bill in the current shape addresses the concerns of cherry picking?
No, I think the bill in the current form, as I understand it, does not address the issue of cherry picking. And, it's a very valid point that you have raised. And in fact, if you, look at the, our experience, what we have seen is that, private sector participation has been quite successful in the urban areas. Now, we have seen a lot of success, for example, anywhere like Calcutta and Bombay were traditionally, handled by the private sector, and, the privatization has been very successful in Delhi. There's also been quite successful in a few urban pockets. But if you go beyond that, Now, for example, in Odisha, obviously there's a new incumbent in place and we don't know what the experience will be in the long term, but we did see that, the previous operator was not able to be very successful in terms of reducing losses. And, once you, and Odisha still is a relatively, compared to others, as moderate agricultural consumers and quite a few, industrial and commercial consumers, but there will be, distribution areas like Bihar, parts of Madhya Pradesh, UP, etc., which have, very large percentage of, agri load or low end domestic, customers to add. So what extent, private sector licenses will be willing to, invest in these, areas remains to be seen. So definitely, cherry picking is going to be a big concern, and in my view, it is not adequately addressed in the existing legislation.
That I had for Dr. Deo is, and to Mr. Kundu is, what would be the acceptability of the proposals by the states as you see them? Will they warm up to the multiple licenses proposal, or will it be like in the past, there'll be a lot of pushback on different issues when it comes to multiple licensees? And what sort of incentives do you think need to be given to get this right?
This is a real problem would come in semi-urban and rural areas. I don't think the private sector will be really able to handle that. Because the reality is that 2003 Act has made metering compulsory. Now you will find that metering does not exist on ground for most of the agriculture pump sets. Even if the meters are installed, they are not read, they cannot be read. So it is always done on the basis of guess estimate. It's very difficult because in the rural area, you will find that the local politician will be telling engineer how to load a transformer. So I can't imagine any of these well-established private sector players going and working in the rural area. And unless you have metering, and this is a long story. Now, once we thought that when we had a serious shortage of electricity, that we should have a separate feeders for agriculture so that others don't suffer. So with Gujarat, Maharashtra, there are other states who have done the complete separation so that we have the meters, at least feeder metering can be done. But you will be surprised to know that the MERC had appointed a committee 2 years ago. That committee went and they found that even on these feeders, meters are not being properly maintained and read. So obviously this is being done because there are vested interests involved. Because like Ashok Rao, who represents
I think his screen is frozen.
Yeah, I think
had to be interest had to be protected. But then protecting interest doesn't mean that we give freebies to them. But then if this cannot be done. So it's very difficult when you look at it, that if you are going to only do this in urban areas, maybe some semi-urban areas, and the rural areas will be left to the state DISCOM, how will you support them? From where will this money come? And if this money still has to come from urban areas, then again the purpose gets defeated. Because we are looking at moving towards a market mechanism. It has to be based on market. It can't be based on freebies coming from somewhere. Otherwise, it has to come from the state budget. But the states don't have that kind of budget anymore. In fact, the very fact that the states like Gujarat, Maharashtra are able to give the subsidy for agriculture straight away is because they have got electricity duty. Now, electricity duty is completely outside the electricity law. And there are high court judgments that this is the law, states have the authority to impose. So you go on. In fact, you'll find that there is a differential electricity duty now on industry. So in the advanced part of the state, the duty is higher. In other parts, it is lower. Now, this is the other part of tariff which is hidden, which is not shown. But then finally, the consumer, suppose you are an industrial consumer, you have to pay that electricity duty. And that's how the states can manage to give subsidy to agriculture, that money. Because anyway, that money is not really with the state.
Sorry, I think we lost his connection again.
He's back. Yeah.
So that money remains with the distribution company, because when they bill, that also includes electricity duty, since that money is already available there. So that is adjusted. But as I mentioned to you, that difference, unless you are going to make zero tariff for all agriculture, then somebody else has to pay. So again, the difficulty comes in that how are we going to have licensees only in urban areas where we will have competition and we will be catering to rural this thing. So those are the, I think, the political issue, and the states will obviously be opposing it, if not directly. They belong to the same party, but you will find that at the time of keeping the elections in view, they will always say that this is something which is very difficult to implement. So we face these realities on ground. And the reason why World Bank had selected Orissa, that was because Orissa has very low consumption in agriculture. Anyway, the water table there is so high that you had no problem, you didn't need any lift irrigation or anything. But that's not the case. Look at what is happening in Punjab and Haryana. They are giving free electricity to farmers. Again, it's not being metered. So we don't know. If we don't measure electricity, then the difficulty comes in that how do you apportion also this burden? So if you are going to say that the state discoms will carry all this burden.
Mr. Kundu?
Yeah. Can you repeat the question, please? Sorry.
So my question was, what do you think will be the acceptability by the states with the proposals that we see today, multiple licensees, and how can the government get it right in terms of incentives if it has to move forward?
See, multiple licenses by the states, obviously they will accept in the places in the urban areas, as actually everyone told that, because rural areas, the infrastructure adequacy is not there. We'll build that infrastructure. If I take a simple example of an EV, when the EV charging policy came up, it was told that you have to put one transformer on 11 kV dedicated feeder for the charging stations, right? The cost associated with it is very high in various areas. So people started not putting up those things. Instead of going for that, they should have gone for assessing the existing transformers, whether there is a amount of the demand can be met by those or not. Similarly, when this comes to this adequacy of infrastructure, if that is being done, second question is the quality of power. Because under Saubhagya, there are various, we are saying that 100% household electrification has been done and everything. But what is the quality of power that is being reaching there? So that is another question. And who will bear the cost? If a private license is putting up adequate infrastructure in the rural areas, which are almost subsidized, then the cost will go to the urban area consumers. So the very first objective of so that the consumer price got reduced or they get a cheaper electricity is getting countered, right? So that is another question, then how that will be made. So these are some of the questions. Another is the cost of switching. Everyone is talking about, Mr. Tandon has told, if there is a meter and if someone will own the meter, if there is someone will try to, if someone wants to switch electricity supplier from one supplier to another, there is a cost for that. Will be at the cost of switching on those things. So there are various aspects that need to be taken care of, because no one is talking about the ground realities, only the policies on there, because here every panelist has talked on that, has already talked on that on the ground realities. So when it is coming to the ground realities, the things will be totally different, because we are doing some projects on the impact assessment of Saubhagya and other things. We're getting the vibes on that, how the ground realities and how that's been changed. So those things need to be taken care into, and there is a proper guideline should be provided based on that. And then we should talk about going into the implementation phase, because it's just on the thought process right now. What do you say?
We're going to take some questions from the audience now. There are some questions that are more comments. I'm not going to necessarily take those. And some questions don't necessarily relate to the topic. I want to take those either. Okay, the first question is Mr. Surya Prakash Rao wants to know, or Ms. Surya Prakash Rao, what are the views of panelists on excessive delegation of rule-making power to central government, encroaching on regulatory jurisdiction of state commissions? Mr. Kapoor?
I've already pointed that out.
Yes.
And so far as I'm concerned, it's a, this is the line which is drawn between regulation and governance is not God-given. It's a man-made instrument. It's what economists will call a mechanism design. You designed a framework and an institution and a governance framework for certain objectives that you laid out in the Electricity Act when you enacted it in 2003. Amongst them was to induce private investment, induce competition, and to provide a level playing field for the same. The moment you ignore the fact that in a center-state relationship, where electricity is a subject matter of the concurrent list, which means the central parliament or the union parliament can enact a law which will override the state laws. But when it comes to implementation and policy making, it's the state which has the dominant role, unless a space is reserved for the center. That's the law of that's the constitution. In that situation, where you are trying to, by the law, take more space out of the hands of state governments and of the regulators, there will be a challenge at a center-state relationship. So that's one. Secondly, I have been a votary of the reforms with consultation, particularly when you're going to make reforms which is going to impact everybody's lives. The previous avatar of NDA had shown the path as we saw in the times of Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee. In fact, the entire reforms came at the back of the two consultations that he had in 96 and 2000, which was in a framework called as the Prime Minister's Conference, Chief Minister's Conference. Now, if that was what it was, I don't know why we cannot muster the same as an approach. And NITI today, as a policy think tank, is pretty much the place where you should incubate these dialogues and try and drive them, adopting the successful model of NDC when the GST Council was put in place and that whole framework was developed. Because unless you're able to persuade all states to look at the problem which is facing the fiscal realities of the country and the states and their viability, and acknowledge that we are not going to play any political games around it, since it impacts everybody's lives and there is no purpose in driving somebody or the other to bankruptcy. Till that time, you will have political economy at play. So I don't see how people are going to be willing and accepting. I can tell you that I am aware that even BJP governed states are not accepting of the reform which is coming through this bill.
Okay. Next question, which is actually 2 or 3 questions that I've rolled into one from Ujjwal Lohat, a couple of them, and one from another person. I'll give it to Mr. Deo, Dr. Deo. Dr. Deo, his main, he says in 2003, focus was open access, but wasn't really successful. As the new amendment, is that going to make it more successful? Also keeping in mind the green energy open access policy, which also allows for people with lower requirements being able to participate in open access.
We have open access, that cost subsidy has to be reduced. Now, for that to happen, from where will this money then come? Because if it has to be reduced, somebody else has to pay for that. And if you want your industry to be competitive, because today we have the highest tariff for industry, and then we talk about Make in India. How is that possible? So this is a very large question mark that we have to face. We cannot be competitive internationally if we are going to continue with this inverted tariff structure. Whereas you will find that in the developed world, industries pay the least cost, whereas here we find that everything is to be recovered from industry so that the others can be cross-subsidized. And that will not really work. And that is the one, again, goes back to the political issue, because the center state, this has to be worked out. Somebody else has to give this money. from where will this come? And it is absolutely necessary that if you want make in India, then your tariffs have to be right. Another issue which is there now, if you take the renewable energy, obviously as we are moving to more and more of non-fossil fuel, the question will come is again when these capacities are to be set up. Now, here the central is assuming the role of deciding how much green power should be purchased by state discoms. But originally the 2003 Act had left it to the state regulator.
The next question I'm going to ask Mr. Majumdar.
Equally distributed. They are distributed. There are 6-7 states which are rich in solar and wind. So again, it comes to how are we going to do that? How are we going to share this burden? So this is something which requires a consultative mechanism, as very rightly Amit was talking about. Unless this is done, you can't just go on forcing. Because we had envisaged the concept of RECs. The whole idea was that the states which don't have a renewable energy potential, they could buy these RECs and meet the demand, meet the target given. But these targets cannot be fixed from the center. They had to be done part of the thing. That is again the prerogative of the states.
Mr. Majumdar, question for you. As per this amendment, this is from Samit Mandal. He says, as per the amendment, if a retail consumer shifts from a particular discom having a wide wire network and therefore having a big capital base resulting in higher tariff and moves to another discom which has low tariff because of low capital base, then the consumer is enjoying reliable supply at the cost of discom having wide network. And he wants to know how to sort out this issue.
I think this is, what I pointed in my previous thing also. I mean, at the end of the day, you'll have to take care of all the legacy issues and you have to see, how all the discoms which are operating in a particular, licensee area, they maintain the, the network in a good shape, because ultimately all these networks are interconnected. And, any kind of, weakness in one network is eventually going to wash back into the other sectors. So I think this is one of the areas which I feel has not been addressed adequately by this amendment, and possibly the weaker discoms, the state-owned discoms, the state government will possibly have to keep, providing them with capital support to ensure that those networks are also kept at high levels.
Next question I will send Mr. Kapoor's way. It's a very short technical question. Is there any provision of the bill that is likely to be in contradiction with or conflicting with the Green Energy Open Access rules? This is from M. Elvarasan.
This requires more than just a quick answer. Yes, but we'll have to go into more details, because you have to understand the rules are posited on a particular approach, and the whole issue that arises is who will decide, because you are granting open access in terms of green energy with a particular incentive structure. There's a cost associated. How are you going to price it? Who's going to pay for it? What is the norm that you will adopt to try and incentivize at least good behavior or efficient behavior? Are you going to allow that to be done irrespective of those norms being complied with? And if you're doing so, have you taken a conscious call to put subsidy on the table? Because the main problem that has been, and that remains as a bugbear for all the state discoms and private discoms, subsidies are announced, but never paid. Tariffs are driven down, but never brought through fiscal discipline. And that is the challenge, which is why I repeatedly come back as a bad penny to the same question. Unless you make it viable, the rest is all a lot of gloss around. You have to address that central question. We have come a fair distance, but don't forget, notwithstanding what we have done in terms of reforms, in terms of market design, we never had a market design in 2003. We have come a long way. MBD, SCD, all of those mechanisms there. You have various market instruments that are being put in place. But don't forget, from those days where Montague Singh Ahluwalia bailout was for 43,000 crores, we are sitting at debts which are over 6 lakh crores. We are sitting with subsidies which are payable by governments, state governments to their discoms over lakh crores, the dues that are payable by discoms to generators which are over that. And bottom line is that every unit out of 1 trillion plus units that are sold in the country is being sold at a loss. What is the trajectory to resolve that? Is it consistent with the objective? There are 3 stated objectives of the country which are at conflict. One stated objective of the country is we want to compete and be the manufacturing hub for the world. Well, good idea. But then are you going to do it if you're going to load the kind of cross-subsidy surcharge, additional surcharge and subsidy burden on industry? Can they compete? Exactly the point that Dr. Dev made. That is the reason we are not able to compete with our regional markets. We are not able to go into all those mechanisms. So India is denying itself its rightful position. So the second issue, we have announced from the world that we want to go into sustainable green. But then are we providing the transition financing? And unless we have those two, and the fact that 25%, nearly 24% of the NIP, the National Infrastructure Pipeline, which is 111 lakh crores plus, is predicated on power sector investments. Where is that coming from? Who will bankroll it? How will it be sustainable?
Next question I will send Mr. Tandon's way. This is from Mohil Mittal. He says that in his understanding, this amendment will worsen the problem of state discoms. Are we heading towards a market where there will be no government discoms and only private discoms?
No, I don't think so that is the case because there would be, see, at the end of the day, multiple discoms would need a network, and the network today is owned by the state discoms predominantly across India. So to that extent, the network ownership will reside, in my view, with some state agency or the state discom because of reasons highlighted with respect to capital expenditure and all. But yes, their cost structures have to be looked into, because at the end of the day, supply has to happen on the wires, and if the wires are not funded properly, there would be no supply. So it would be better, I would say it would be a good proposition for these discoms who own the networks to have multiple licenses to bring in first, efficiencies would definitely be there, and I believe that there would be the market would move to some extent to have realization of full costs for these discoms as well.
Mr. Tandon, I'm going to ask you one other question. Several questions relating to safety from Mr. Davis or A.R. Davis, Mr. or Ms. Is there anything in the new amendments that is about safety?
Safety actually is driven through the mechanisms being put in place by the authority, which is Central Electricity Authority. So to that extent, wherever there is a requirement to put in technical specifications, they definitely have that comes into play. And there are safety regulations in place which are required to be met by the discoms as well as generators and transmission companies as well. So to that extent, safety becomes a prime mover from a regulation compliance perspective. And we do at Tata Power Delhi Distribution, we also are governed by those safety regulations. So yeah, there is always a fact there.
There is a question from a attendee, doesn't give the name. It says, in case of parallel licenses, they have different power networks or same power network. I guess they have different power networks. So I think the answer is
network would be one. See, parallel licenses, if the way it has been drafted, network, the duplication of network is to be avoided.
So his question is, or her question is, so they'll have different metering systems. And so what does that mean from a technical point of view?
So today, if there is only one discom which owns the meters and which actually meters the consumption. Tomorrow, once there are multiple licenses, there would be different metering companies there, because at the end of the day, disputes may come up in the metering aspects as well. So to that extent, there would be a new player into play.
Mr. Kundu, does the new bill give any new benefits to green energy power producers?
Look, Mr. Kundu has logged out. I'll just.
Okay. All right, no issues. Mr. Majumdar,
Yeah, sorry.
any new benefits being granted to green energy power producers under this bill?
I'm not aware really. I don't think so.
Okay. The next question is going to be, okay, I'll send it to Mr. Kapoor's way. It says from Amolak Singh Wazir, why hasn't the bill addressed the policy distortions and grid code requirements between various states? For example, if one state requirement of open access connection is only single ABT meter, another one requires 1+1 meter. So I'm not sure whether you would like to answer that.
No, we certainly answer it. It's obvious in the question itself.
Okay, all right. So it has not addressed it.
No, it's not addressed it because they have not addressed it. If they had addressed it, it would be different. That's exactly why I said there is need for consultation of all stakeholders.
Maybe I didn't. His question begins with why. Why hasn't the bill addressed?
Because it's a difficult question to address. So it's always easy to sidestep a big wall and go around the pothole.
Okay. There's a comment from Mr. Chandrasekhar Pillai. It says, after 20 years of Electricity Act, disclosure of interest rate for cost of debt capital is necessary, but not there in the sector. I don't know, any comments here? Are they not required to disclose interest rate for cost of debt?
No, of course it is. In the tariff filings, everybody has to disclose, unless you are in a competitive bidding or you're away from regulatory oversight. The fact of the matter is that in spite of disclosure, you don't get paid accordingly. It's not that you don't disclose.
There are a number of other questions which I'm going to just skip because some of them don't relate to the topic here. But there's one question somebody has which is quite interesting, which is, I'm not sure it's even possible, but he wants to know from the panelists, what would they like to be, discussed in the Parliament session? What's the one aspect that they would like to be discussed? So, Mr. Kapoor, we can begin with you.
How to look at the viability of the power sector in the country, and in that enmesh the two movements that are there: development of the market and energy transition. Keeping the customer always in focus. If India can get financing of 50,000 crores from Japan on a sovereign to sovereign basis at 0.5% interest, we surely can get for 50 years then, we surely can get debt financing of 25 years to try and take away the burden, which has come because of regulatory asset, flatten the curve, make it viable and go into competitive framework.
Dr. Deo, what would you like the parliamentarians to focus on? Assuming that this actually gets passed, we've seen this act before, where something is introduced and not necessarily pushed through.
Very fact it has been referred to the standing committee means that they don't want.
Okay, there's a bandwidth issue there. We'll
Here
wait
now. So that is the reality. So we have a draft, but that draft is not going to be final, and then the issues are important and they have to be addressed. Then only we can really talk about any realistic implementable law. Otherwise, we'll just continue talking about various changes to the 2003 after 20 years, and we will not have moved any further.
Mr. Majumdar, what would you like the parliamentarians to focus on?
Again, I think the biggest thing will be to focus on the existing liability. I mean, as we have pointed out here, there are over 6 lakh crores rupees of liability, which includes, the debts as well as, liabilities to the generators. So I think one of the things is that we have to clear, whenever we are starting this, we have to start it with a clean slate, because then otherwise, the distribution companies, the existing incumbent distribution companies, which will anyway be risking losing a lot of their high, paying consumers. If they are to be, burdened with all these regulatory assets and all these liabilities, their functioning will be very badly impacted. So I think taking care of those, issues of the past will be very critical.
Mr. Tondon, what would you want the parliamentarians to focus on?
If you look at it, the tariff policy talks about the setting of tariff setting process to be plus minus 20% of the cost of supply. So viability of the sector is very important to be addressed first. Legacy issues, yes, have to be addressed, but yes, actually the customer wants quality power. He is ready to pay money, but the money has to be proper. It has to be, that money should be determined properly. So to that extent, yeah, first thing is viability, and then structural changes, and then looking at the cost structure and make it viable. That's it.
Actually one more question from me, which requires just a yes or no answer. Do you think this legislation will actually go through in this session or even the next session, Mr. Kapoor? So you're muted. You're muted. Yeah.
It's a $1 trillion question. I hope it goes through, but I hope it goes through after a rigorous consultation and revision at the standing committee, not just the way it is. Sorry?
Well, we need reform. The question is, it has to be really debated, and not that you just pass a bill and then you are not able to implement it.
So Majumdar,
Yes.
do you think it will go through? It will be pushed through?
Well, I think the government has a legislative majority to push it through. But again, there will be a lot of resistance from, many states, because it will be putting them under a lot of burden.
Okay. Mr. Tandon, you have the last word, seemingly.
I think consultation process has to be ascertained, because there are a lot of gray areas which have to be ironed. And so,
But do you think this will actually happen? That's my question.
it should happen, but it will take its own time.
Yeah, right. I think with that, we'll end the session. Thank you very, very much. It's been a very interesting